Egregious. What does this word mean? What happens when you encounter words that you are unfamiliar with? You don't have a dictionary next to you, and you have an exam to complete, and time is running out. Well, you can try to figure out the word in its context, the context of the sentence. But if the word is one of the choices, then you might be in a little bit of trouble. So here's what I propose. Here's what I think you should do. A simple method for decoding words that you are unfamiliar with. Our key is to break the word down into its parts. So a word like egregious, you might look at it and say, well, does any part of that word remind me of another word? And if it does, it might be a word like, let's say, congregation. So when I look at egregious, I see G-R-E-G, and I would think of the word congregation. That's a word that we're all familiar with. And congregation has that same root in it, G-R-E-G. What's a congregation? When people gather together. That might give me a clue. What about the E part of it, the prefix? Well, by now, you might know that E means out of. See, how do I know that? Well, think of a word with E in it. Erupt. Well, let's see if this works for us. We're going to break this word down into its parts. Okay, and we're left with OUS. Okay, so let's see what the parts mean now. So I take a word like erupt, and I break it into its parts, and I know that E means out of. So when the volcano erupts, lava comes out of it. So now I've pegged E. The E in egregious has something to do with out of. That prefix E means out of. What about congregation? Well, that word congregation has a G-R-E-G inside, and it means to gather with people. So that's when people come together in a church or in a location. We call it a congregation. So now I have G-R-E-G having to do something perhaps with people. So E means out of, and G-R-E-G means crowd. And those are their actual meanings in Latin. G-R-E-G means crowd, and E means out of. So the word egregious now, and look at it again, we'll say, okay, we have some clues now. E, out of, G-R-E-G, the crowd. Egregious means something that stands out or that is outstanding in a negative way, literally standing out of the crowd. At first, the word meant anything that stood out of a crowd, but then it got a negative connotation, and now that's all that it's known by. So egregious is something that is so negative, it is negative in an outstanding way, and it gets its meaning from its two parts, E and Greg, and that final suffix OUS simply means full of, or characteristic of. So out of the crowd. Egregious. Here's a sentence. That was no ordinary error. It was an egregious mistake. It was outstandingly bad. Not just bad, but outstandingly bad. Egregious means outstandingly bad. Again, it gets its meaning from E or X, which means out, and G-R-E-G, which means group or crowd. Now I've learned two word parts. I've learned that E or EX means out, and I've learned that G-R-E-G means group or crowd. Now I can take these two parts now and use them to analyze the meanings of other words. Erupt, we know means out of, the volcano erupted. Expedite, again, ex means out of, and expedite means to get something out quickly. Let's expedite this work. Exonerate, ex means out. Exonerate means to free, let someone out of jail or out from the guilt. Exonerate. Emote, get your feelings out. Eviscerate. What does eviscerate mean? To literally gut out something, to cut out the guts of it. He eviscerated the opponent's arguments. Edict. Dict means, D-I-C-T means to speak. So an edict is a proclamation. It was proclaimed out. So you see how E or EX can help us to analyze other words? What about GREG? The word is gregarious. Congregate, segregate, aggregate, all of these words have to do with the crowd. So if you're gregarious, you're someone who loves to be with other people. You love to be with the crowd. Congregate, you're gathering together. Segregate, well, we know what that means. They were segregated by race. They kept them out of the crowd, away from the crowd. And aggregate is a total sum. So the total group of everything that you're doing is the aggregate. So now we see how GREG helps us to make sense of other words. E, GREG. And the whole picture now, gregarious. Look at all the words we've learned. Or can decode, congregate. Segregate. Aggregate. All having to do with a group or a crowd. Eviscerate, having to do with E and therefore out of. Edict, to speak out, to proclaim, proclamation. Emote, let your emotions come out. Exonerate, freed from, out of guilt, out of prison. Expedite, let's get it out of the way, quickly, to do it quickly. And erupt, we know what that means, the volcano erupted. So you see how powerful word parts can be. And there's more. Take the word segregate. It's broken into SE, which means away, and GREG, and then that suffix. So away from the crowd. So we know that SE now is a prefix that means away from the crowd. SE means apart, and GREG means crowd or group. So when I segregate someone, I'm setting them apart from the crowd, or setting that group apart from society. Segregation forces a group of people to live separately from others. And that's how that word gets its meaning. So what does segregation mean? When people are forced to live in separate racial groups, it's called segregation. SE then leads me to other words. Seclude, secede, and seduce. All of them having to do with apart or away from. So if you're secluded, you are away from society. CLU means shut in, or CLUD means to shut in. I'm secluded. Okay? If I secede, the southern states seceded. They went away from the country. to form their own. And we'll find that cede in secede means to go. They went to, so literally to go apart. Seduce, seduce, means to lead someone away with your affection, or from an affection that they had before. We'll find that duce means to lead, and se means away.